And look who's coming up.
All right, 5:24 in the Eastern time zone. This show is just flying by. I can't believe it's almost over, but we have some amazing stuff still to come for you. We are going to talk right now about some fantasy hockey and information that you need to know because I don't know if you are already had your fantasy drafts or if it's coming up, but if it is, we're going to help you out with what you need to know. And joining us is our good friend, Michael Amato from Dobber Hockey, of course, Goalie Post and Sportsnet. Congratulations, Michael. We saw the post this week that you'll be covering fantasy hockey for Sportsnet as well. So that is great to hear.
Thanks, Dean. Yeah, looking forward to it starting next week.
Awesome, beautiful. But this is kind of such an interesting time right now. We talked last week about guys that need some line luck and things like that, and there's a lot of training camp sort of luck that also kind of extends to that a little bit. And while I caution people not to get too caught up in preseason statistics, I would caution them about watching what lines people are playing on in the preseason as opposed to who's scoring against AHL or ECHL lineups. How important is the preseason, but also how can you get carried away with the preseason for people out there as well?
Yeah, I think it's easy to fall into a trap of getting too excited about things we see in the preseason. But at the same time, I think probably the biggest thing to watch is just opportunities that are created, right? Like we see a lot of injuries in camp, and obviously that'll bump a player up in the lineup. And sometimes it ends up being a really good thing for the whole season. Sometimes it doesn't, work out at all. Or sometimes that player might even just be, useful for the first month or two of the season, maybe as a short-term ad. So it's definitely good to pay attention and just see how some of the line combinations are shaking up and sort of seeing who's maybe taking advantage of some opportunities that you didn't think they had originally.
Yeah, it's different than those playoff guys. Like, the most famous John Druce stories about the playoff heroes where they come out. That's different because those guys are legendary. You don't hear about preseason legends. The biggest one that comes to mind is, I'm in Edmonton, and Ty Ratty was on McDavid's line for a little bit in the preseason, and everybody thought this was going to be the second coming now. And, it was obvious to most people that this was just a strange experiment the Oilers were trying. So opportunity is important, but realistic expectations for certain players have to come into play, and historic value. It's not like all of a sudden a guy goes from a career AHLer to being on the line with the best guy in the world. That just rarely happens.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think when we talk about some of these players and some of these opportunities, it's definitely not an invitation to go out and draft them, pretty high up in your leagues. It's more just, right. And a lot of them might not even be draftable. It just might be, hey, put this in the back of your mind, make a note of it, and keep an eye on it for the first week or so. If you see said player is sticking with that line and he's off to a good start, then hey, maybe there's a good waiver wire ad. And if it doesn't work out, then it's really, not a lot lost. You can just drop them again and grab somebody else.
So the first kind of situation we're going to talk about is what's happening in Vancouver, and Brock Besser is injured again. Unfortunately, he did have a career high 71 games played last year, but that's a career high, like 71. This is a guy, unfortunately, that's oft injured, obviously can produce. So obviously you're looking at Brock Besser and probably moving him down right now with him being out 3 to 4 weeks. But that does, as you talk about, mean opportunity for somebody else.
Yep, for sure. And it's definitely tough luck for Besser. I think I had him pegged for his first 30-goal season this year. Had he stayed healthy, he might still hit it depending on how soon he comes back. But it's interesting to see for a lot of these Canuck players, like Pettersson, Horvat, and JT Miller especially really excelled when Boudreau took over. But obviously they only got a little more than half a season with him last year. So seeing that for a full year should produce some really, really strong results. And I think there was talk of maybe the Canucks stacking that top line with Pettersson, Miller, and Besser. So I thought Besser would really thrive there this year. But now that he's gone, one name that I think I've seen kind of floating around is Andrei Kuzmenko, who had a lot of hype this offseason, and I had a lot of questions about him this summer, just what his prospects were. And I wasn't necessarily super high on him just because I think once you get past that Canucks top line, it's tougher to get offense out of that group. But I saw the other day he was practicing on power play 1. We'll see how he does there in the preseason, if he takes advantage of that opportunity. And maybe if he gets a bump up in the lineup as well with Besser gone now, if he gets to play with maybe a Pettersson or a JT Miller, I think that could really help his value. I think he's probably a guy that's known to some people, but you might be able to find much later in your drafts or potentially even off waivers early in the year if he really does take off.
So it kind of brings up an interesting point. When there's a guy like that that you kind of have on your radar, I sometimes am of the feeling like I want to go get that guy, but a lot of people want to wait. And obviously the big worry is waiting too long and somebody else is thinking the same thing. That's kind of the art of a draft strategy, is knowing, not just who to pick, but when to pick them and when to wait to maybe pick them at another time. It's risky, but if you can do it, you can get some really, really good gems at different spots.
Yep. And it's also probably the art of how well you know your fellow fantasy hockey players in your league, and how well you think they're also paying attention, and when you think that player is gonna get drafted, right? I think we see a lot of it with goalies too. A lot of people trying to wait a little bit later to grab a goalie, and you're always thinking like, can I pass him up for one more pick? Will it get back to me before he goes? It's always kind of like a cat and mouse game there. But yeah, it's a good point that you mentioned of like kind of understanding your league and when guys are going to get taken relative to like the players in your league and when they're picking.
Yeah, I'm sort of the mindset, like, if you like a player, go get him. I've talked to Craig Button about this, and, draft years where they were drafting and they waited and waited on a guy, and then he got taken, and they're like, well, why didn't we just take that guy, right? So I'm kind of the mindset, if you like a guy enough, you should go out and get him. One guy that I think should be drafted a lot higher this year, and you have him on this list, is Phil Kessel. And, Phil Kessel has been productive. I think the myth that Phil Kessel is not a good team player, is not a good defensive player, all that stuff is garbage. I mean, he proved how good he was in Pittsburgh, winning those cups, being an important player on those teams. And he went to a bad Arizona team and still had over 40 assists. Now, I talked to Kelly McCrimmon when they signed this player in Phil Kessel, and then they love him and they think he has a lot more. And obviously, he's getting some ice time with Jack Eichel. I mean, this could be a really great situation. Again, another situation you should watch, but I think Eichel and the Eichel situation gives Kessel more of a bump in drafts going into them, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally. And like you mentioned, he had 52 points last year on a pretty bad Arizona team. So now he's going to a much better spot. Obviously, if he gets into that top 6, I think if he sticks with Eichel, that would be a lot better, obviously. But I think anywhere in that top 6, he still has value. And him and Eichel have been playing together so far in the preseason. He assisted on an Eichel goal the other night. So yeah, he's someone that can also probably play on at least one of your power plays. I don't know if he'll be on the first power play in Vegas, but he'll probably be on at least the second. And excuse me, yeah, he's got a lot of talent. And yeah, like you said, he's had maybe a bad rap, but as far as, some of the defensive play goes or what kind of a teammate he is or whatever, I don't know if that's founded or not, but I know in fantasy hockey, that's not super relevant as long as the player is, producing points. If he's producing 50 or 60 points, unless he's got like a horrible plus minus, I don't think you're too concerned with his defensive attributes or what kind of shape he is or whatever other things people want to say about Phil Kessel. But yeah, I think it's a guy that also needs to be in a spot where, hey, the team's going to be competitive and he feels important, like they have a chance to win. I think you saw that in Toronto when the team struggled, and then he went to Pittsburgh and he just excelled. And then I think again he goes to Arizona. They kind of, obviously are going in the wrong direction, rebuilding. And now I think you're going to hopefully see him pick it up again in Vegas.
Yeah, and this is I look at this Vegas team, and I think a lot of that top 6 can be interchangeable. And, Phil Kessel still has to stick in that top 6, because I think going into it, a lot of people had him in their top 9. But you're right, if he gets in that top 6, the power plays are interchangeable. I think that's a really, really good situation for him and for Vegas. Now, I'm not saying I think Phil Kessel's like a third round pick or anything in your drafts. I still think he's a later pick, but a guy that you should be probably moving up or at least watching a lot more closely, because there's no reason Phil Kessel in a top 6 could be a 65, 70 point, who knows, with Vegas. If he's a 50 point guy in Arizona, he could be a 60 point guy with better line mates in Vegas.
Yeah, easily. And I think the other thing we should probably mention is, he doesn't miss any games, right? Like he's going to pass Keith Yandel probably in the first few weeks of the season for the Ironman streak. And that's huge for fantasy hockey. You're going to get probably 82 games out of him. The only risk is, I think, some of those other Vegas players, there's more concern in that area, like whether it's Mark Stone or Eichel about missing time. And if that happens, what's that going to mean for Kessel? But yeah, I think there's enough positives about Kessel in Vegas to definitely take a chance on him. That's for sure.
It's a great point by you. Games played are currency for fantasy owners, so you're getting every game. Phil Kessel is going to be productive, so you could throw him out there. It's an absolutely good point. But if the guys around him are falling down with injuries, it's not going to help. All right, let's talk about some goaltenders. And Philip Grubauer looking pretty good early. Again, obviously preseason, but the Kraken have a couple of shutouts. This is an area of obvious weakness. Philip Grubauer had a great season in Colorado, went and signed the contract, and then struggled. This is kind of like the redemption tour year for him, and I like guys on redemption tours. I think they have a lot to prove, so I like those guys in fantasy.
Yeah, definitely. And he's probably the goalie I had the most questions about in the summer. Everyone was asking me if they should take a chance on him. And it's going to be interesting to see how he bounces back, because like you said, you can probably get him in a lower draft spot because of the year he had last year. There's a lot of upside to his game because of that. He's going to play a ton, probably, because there's nobody really there. I think Martin Jones is there to challenge him for starts. He's not going to really give much in the way of that. So I think Grubauer is going to play a ton, and that's always valuable if your league has, count saves and things like that. So he's definitely a starter that's going to play a lot. So I think the only concern I would have with him is, I think if people are just taking a glance at his season last year, they might chalk it up to, the Kraken being an expansion team and being really weak. But if you actually look at some of their defensive metrics last year, they were pretty good defensively. Like they were top 10 in high danger chances allowed, shots allowed, total scoring chances allowed. So it wasn't really a case of the team just being really poor defensively in front of him. I think a lot of it was Grubauer really struggling, which at first glance you may not think. Because, I think we know a lot of goaltending now is sort of related to team structure, and how goalies really succeed or fail is a lot of times related to the team in front of them. So that's one thing that concerned me about his numbers last year. But I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity with him, because you can probably get him at a good value draft pick, maybe get him for a good price in a trade even, or something like that. There's just a lot of upside to take a chance on him. And as you mentioned, so far the Kraken haven't given up a goal in the preseason. Grubauer looked really sharp in his one appearance. So there's definitely reason to be optimistic. But again, preseason, take it with a grain of salt. But I think you can hope for the best with some of the stuff we've heard about Grubauer so far, and sort of, I think, maybe the way the team is trending this year.
And, it'd be interesting to watch Darcy Kemper. He's kind of going similar but different situation, leaving Colorado after winning a cup and, having good numbers. Obviously going to a more established team in Washington. I think Kemper was, in a lot of leagues, he was top 5 last year. I'm not sure if the win totals will be as much, but still, I think that's another situation worth watching. And I still think you're going to get good value out of Darcy Kemper. I still think he can be, top 7 in goalie points this year.
Yeah, for sure. He's obviously a high-end starter on a quality team. He doesn't have anybody to really challenge him for playing time. So he's probably gonna push, 55, 60 starts again, if he's healthy. So I agree with you. I think just everyone leaving Colorado, it's always an adjustment, because the Avs are so good and they just play in the other team's end a lot, right? So anytime you're playing in the other team's end, you're not going to give up that many goals. So I think it's always going to be an adjustment. But I think Kemper's kind of landing will be a lot softer than Grubauer's, because I think the Caps are obviously a much stronger team.
Yeah, and it could be better for fantasy because he's going to face more shots actually than in Colorado. All right, so the John Tavares situation in Toronto, out 3 weeks, and again, just like we talked about with Brock Besser, this opens up playing time. I think they said Michael Bunting was going to get some power play time in place of Tavares, but there's other guys that get impacted not just for moving up, but not having John Tavares, namely Mr. Nylander. Is he the guy that's biggest impacted without Tavares?
Yeah, I would probably say so. I think Nylander, he's been moved around a lot over the past couple of years for the Leafs. He's moved up a little bit. He's moved down to the third line. I think he'll be okay as long as, Tavares isn't out for longer than what's already been stated, the 3 weeks or so. I just curious to see how it's going to affect some other younger players trying to make the team. Like, this was maybe an opportunity for Nick Robertson to step up and possibly play on that line with Tavares and Nylander. But now obviously someone like him being a more offensive type player without Tavares there, I don't know if that's the perfect role for him. I think Dennis Malgin scored a goal last night and drew a couple of penalties. He's the guy that I think the Leafs are looking at that might be able to fill that role. Maybe Alex Kerfoot, who played the wing on that line last year, shifts to the middle. Maybe they keep him with William Nylander and see if Robertson fits with those two. So I think Tavares, like a lot of people have talked about him losing a step in the past couple of years, but he really holds that line together. And I think without him, there's really like a lot of uncertainty with a lot of the players around there.
Yeah, it's funny how John Tavares kind of gets lost in the shuffle in that Toronto media spotlight and that team as well, because this is obviously an incredibly talented guy. So the Pittsburgh Penguins, this is an interesting team. They've brought in a new crew in Hextall and Burke, and they're sort of like trying to retool on the fly with their veterans, and they re-signed Malkin. One of the guys that they got last year was Rickard Rakell. What do you think? Is this a guy that people should be bumping up because of who he might play with in that top six?
Yeah, he's such a difficult player because he always seems like he's going to produce so much more than he does. And obviously, like, it seems like he might end up fitting with Crosby and Gensel, which is like an obvious player you'd want to grab. Just for playing with those two alone, you figure he should put up a lot of points. But he's kind of disappointed the last few years. He's had really low shooting percentages over the past few seasons. And I think a lot of times we tend to think those will kind of, even themselves out. But with Rakell, I think it just might be an issue of him not being the best finisher. I know he had a few 30-goal seasons a while back, but he hasn't really come close to that since. And already, this preseason, he's got 7 shots in 2 games and no goals. So it's kind of already trending to what he does. He's just a guy that sort of struggles to finish of late. So I don't know. I think the opportunity is there. It's worth taking a chance on him, but I think you also need to sort of temper your expectations that, hey, like, this guy has a lot of talent, but he's just one of those players, that might not be the best finisher and might not produce you the best results. But if you're playing with Crosby and Gensel, I mean, he's probably going to provide something for you at some point.
Yeah, you think playing with those guys, the puck's at least going to bounce off you. But it's the same. When Phil Kessel went to Pittsburgh, everybody says, oh, this guy's going to score 50, 60. And he turned into a disher. He turned into a more creative player. And it's not just like, oh, this guy has skill, and this guy has skill. Throw them together and see what happens. You have to have chemistry. And I agree. Rakell has all the attributes, but kind of leaves you wanting more. So, there are some guys that you're like, okay, I'm not sure I want to take a chance on that guy, but you should always have a watch list going of guys that you maybe wanted to draft or didn't, or for whatever reason. That's a guy that kind of I would rather put on my watch list than actually draft, because I have been disappointed. Now, watch, this is the year he comes out gangbusters, right? But there are guys like that for me every year. Like David Perron is a guy that I like drafting late in rounds because he just seems to always produce. Rakell has been a guy who's left me wanting more, so he would more go on my watch list. But everybody obviously is a little bit different.
Yeah, no, and you bring up Perron's a great example of a guy that not a lot of people talk about, but his point paces over the last 5 years have just been like off the charts, and he always produces. Like he always puts up big numbers. But again, he doesn't maybe have the flash of a Raquel, and maybe like some of the I guess pedigree you would say of talent like Raquel does, but he just produces. And I think, you know, a lot of people look at Raquel and think he's always gonna break out, and it just really hasn't come. And who knows? Like you said, maybe this is the year. But yeah, I think a lot of those guys that are going to be paired with two really elite players in the top six, they're always worth, you know, at minimum keeping them on your watch list.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, so we talked last week about guys filling out different categories, which is, you know, obviously important. You know, points rule fantasy, especially if goals are weighted or things like that. But a situation on Long Island with Alex Romanoff playing with Noah Dobson, tell us why that's worth watching right now.
So I really made note of that because Romanov is really great if your league has hits and blocks. He was in the top 20 in both categories last year. He can probably give you 2 of each per game, roughly. But his issue is he's a very, very low point scorer. I think he had 13 points in all of last year. But Dobson's obviously a much stronger offensive player. If they're making up that first pairing in Long Island, and if he gets a lot more playing time and a bigger role, maybe, you know, Romanov, if he gets even if he gets up to 25 points, I think that's a player you can roster in a deep league if he gives you those other categories, you know, as maybe your last defenseman or somebody you can rotate in off the bench. Because those volume categories are really key, and there's not many guys that kind of fill in both the hits and blocks the way he does. But his point totals definitely leave something to be desired, so you got to make sure you sort of compensate for that with other players.
Yeah, I like those guys as spot fillers. I mean, you're probably, like you said, you can rotate them in and out, and know you're going to pick up a few different categories. You know, baseball, those stolen base guys, you know, throw them in to try to win that category or whatever it might be. But I think, you know, the big thing when you go into drafting, the same thing in the NHL, is what are your expectations? If you're drafting Romanoff and thinking he's going to be every day for you in fantasy, your expectations are wrong, unfortunately, in my opinion. But if you're looking at him as being a guy who can fill in, whereas some of the other guys, it's all about expectations. And the same thing with fantasy. If you draft a guy that you're expecting 40 points from and you get 5, well, is it that guy's fault, or was it your fault for the expectations you had?
Yeah, totally. And you definitely have to have like defined roles for most of the players that you take. And, you know, obviously, like, it's great if a guy like Austin Matthews gets some hits, but you know exactly why you're drafting Austin Matthews. And I think it works the other way too, right? Like, you know, if you're drafting a Romanov, he's not going to put up a lot of points, but, you know, if you can't win the goals category, but you can win the hits and the blocks category, you know, it's just as well, right? Like, those categories are worth the same at the end of the day. And there's not too many players you can roster that don't score a lot of points, but Romanov is probably one of them.
Yeah, and that's important, is finding those guys, because if you get the wrong guy, you're just getting nothing out of them. You know, it's finding those right guys that are just kind of on the periphery, right on the edge of being, you know, fan, and maybe a lot of people don't know about them, because that's in the end is taking players or waiver wires or things like that could certainly put you over the top. And win your league. I mean, you can't just draft your team and sit back. You know, you have to be watching for guys that get hot and cold, in my opinion. If you don't do that, you're just donating your money.
Yeah, totally. And you have to look a lot of times in the not so obvious places for players. And look for other players that people in your league won't be targeting as well, right? Somebody like Romanov's probably not on the radar in a lot of leagues, unless you're in a really deep multi-cat league. He might be, but yeah, he's someone that can give you, I think, a lot of value like a lot of people wouldn't probably be thinking about drafting him, or probably he'll be sitting on waivers in most leagues. And yeah, you might be able to find something there that gives you a huge boost.
Awesome stuff, Michael. As usual, Dobber Hockey, Goalie Post, and now Sportsnet. Terrific to have you on board, and I think you gave a lot of people a lot to think about heading into some drafts this weekend. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us today.
Anytime, Dean. Thanks.
You bet. There's Michael Amato. You can find him on Twitter at Amato_Mike, and Dobber Hockey, Goalie Post, Sportsnet. He's got you covered with everything you need when it comes to fantasy hockey.